When we think of movies, what comes to mind is a very specific look. Very specific and at the same time very personal. Some of us think of comedy, some of us think of drama or horror or something in between. All of these types of films have a very unique look that most of us call a cinematic look. We all want this in our films, wonder how to get it, and buy gear, filters, plugins, lights, and more to get to this mysterious, sought-after look. After 10 years of experience and having graded over 40 feature films, I've come to learn what makes up a cinematic look.
Whenever any of us make a movie, we want it to look like the movies we love. We want it to look polished, we want it to look gritty, we want it to look beautiful, and one of the top requests that I get as a colorist is how can I make something look more cinematic? The reason I'm making this course is because everyone asks this question, everyone wants to know, and in this course we'll go over not only how we can get there, but what traits to look for in footage that's already shot to make your film and your project look more like a movie. My name is Fred Trevino, and this course is about creating a cinematic look. I've graded over 40 feature films, and I've worked on hundreds of videos for clients such as Prada, HBO, ESPN, Sundance Channel, Versace, Pepsi, and a lot more. This course is intended for anyone who's looking to improve their footage, improve their knowledge of color correction and color grading, and know what it takes to make something look like a movie. Let's get started.
So in this lesson, I want to go over some of the traits that make up a cinematic look. The reason I want to go over these things before we jump into the actual grading is because half of a colorist's job is having the eye to spot what can be done and what can't be done. If, for example, you get a film that is very poorly shot or shot with very few cinematic characteristics, it'll be very hard to enhance those characteristics and get a true film-like look. I think this is one of the main reasons that so many people have trouble making their footage look cinematic, and that's that they just don't know what traits a movie has that gives that special, unique look we all love and are used to seeing. So with that in mind, let's jump in.
Okay, so in this lesson, I want to kind of talk a little bit about film and the history of film and where this look kind of comes from. One thing you have to realize is what we consider a cinematic look is really just the history of technology, the history of different cameras. So the first one, let's start off with, is pretty easy. Let's talk about grain. So basically, grain is something that comes from old 35mm film. It's basically the size of the different pieces of silver that are in actual physical film stock, whether it's 35, 16, or 8mm. Basically, if a film stock is a high ISO film stock, it means that it tends to be grainier because it has larger bits of silver in the film stock, which helps catch light. And so the larger these little pieces of silver are in the film, that's what grain is. Now, because of the decades and decades of watching movies, we've come to associate grain as something that makes something look cinematic. Even though for decades, Kodak, Fuji were just trying to get that grain out of movies, and they would promote their film stocks as having very fine grain. Now you find that because we're so used to seeing this grain in movies, it's something that people want to see. Okay, so when someone says cinematic look though, some people might have a ton of grain in mind, some people might have no grain in mind. Okay, so another characteristic of a cinematic look is frame rate. Basically, as the film travels through the camera, the speed at which that film travels through the camera can control the look. Think of something going 240 frames per second, which creates extreme slow motion, something going through the film at 120 frames per second, which creates slow motion. And then if you think of old-timey film, a lot of times those movies went at 18 frames per second, which created that very kind of jumpy, jittery look that we see in old movies. Once film had to sync up with sound, that's where we get the 24 frames per second. And after decades of seeing the specific look of the film running through the camera at 24 frames per second, that kind of became the look that we consider to be cinematic or how movies look. And so basically the point that I'm trying to make here is that the subtle changes in frame rate do affect how something looks. And this, again, is part of what makes something look like a movie. Okay, so the next characteristic is depth of field. Depth of field is basically what's in focus and what is not in focus, specifically if the background is blurry or if the entire image is completely in focus. The way this is used is basically to attract attention to specific details. Think of something like a close-up on a character. Usually in movies when we see close-ups or extreme close-ups, the background is completely out of focus and only the character is in focus. Or if we want to see a complete wide shot of, say, something like a battle scene in a movie, everything is in focus. So depth of field is another tool that can be used to control the look of a film. And basically how we can use this while we're color grading is that we have certain tools in DaVinci Resolve that control what's in focus and what is not in focus. And a lot of these tools are actually designed to look like lenses with a shallow depth of field. It's something that a lot of cinematographers, a lot of directors use as a tool to create something, and we've gotten so used to this look that a shallow depth of field tends to be associated with a film or cinematic look. The next characteristic is lens choice. Basically, lens choice is how wide of a shot you have or how tight of a shot you have. One of the easiest ways to tell if someone is new to shooting something is that they use a lot of wide shots and they don't even think about which lens they're using. A good example of this is a lot of first-time filmmakers will have a zoom lens and they basically turn on the camera, leave the camera as is, which is normally the widest setting, and they shoot a scene that's
in a wide shot. That same scene might be a little bit more powerful and a little bit more cinematic if they were to zoom in, get more tight close-ups using the telephoto part of the lens, which is the tighter, more zoomed in part of the lens, over the wide angle part of the lens. So lens choice completely can change the emotion and feel of a scene based on whether you're shooting very wide or very tight.
The selection of lens dictates, on top of what we've already mentioned of frame rate and depth of field and film grain, the grainy look of ISO, all of these layer on top of what makes something look cinematic. You're seeing that as we're going, we're kind of building a look through all of these characteristics. So the next trait that's really important is composition. This is one that we can all see because it basically tells us how something was framed, which is another term for that. We all know popular films where things might be symmetrical, we might have negative space. Knowing compositions and knowing what certain looks can create certain emotions are really what some people might call a cinematic look. For example, a classic example that I get all the time is Wes Anderson films. We all know that he tends to pose everything and compose a lot of the shots very symmetrical. So a lot of times people might come and say, oh, I want my film to look very cinematic, and they send me stills of this Wes Anderson film or that Wes Anderson film. And sometimes you can go in there and reframe a shot, make it look a little bit more to what they are wanting, a little bit more to a certain style of cinema. Or sometimes if a shot is too beautifully composed, you can go in there and kind of rotate it and shift it a little bit, make it look a little bit off to create a different kind of cinematic look. So again, composition, we're just adding to the different layers of what makes something look like a movie. Okay, so the last characteristic I want to talk a little bit about in depth is quality of light. As you know, lighting is one of the most important things in creating a look for your image. As a colorist, it's important to be able to look at an image and know whether something was shot with hard lighting, soft lighting, tungsten, daylight, 5600 Kelvin, 3200 Kelvin, fluorescent lighting, and knowing what color each one of those lighting sources is will help you in determining what can be done to that light, what can be done to the image to make it look a little bit more cinematic. Really, that's all we're doing when we're color correcting or color grading is we're manipulating the lighting. So we might have hard lighting, we might have soft lighting, you might have the color of light as well. For example, street lights, sodium vapor lights, which are very orange or very red. These definitely have influence on the look you're going for. I hope by this point you're kind of getting that it's really a compilation of lens choice, lighting, field of view, depth of field, grain, composition, all of these little different bits that come together to make something look cinematic. Okay, so one more thing that I want to bring up, besides all these other traits that I've already brought up, is that things like the art department, wardrobe, makeup, even things like aspect ratio, all affect the look and make something look more movie-like or film-like. Think of widescreen, the aspect ratio, 2:3:5 aspect ratio. When we take, you can take any movie, something you shot on your phone, put bars on the top and the bottom to make it look like it's a 2:3:5 aspect ratio, and it'll suddenly look like a movie. Again, because that's what we're used to seeing and that's what we're used to associating for a film. And knowing all of these things and how they come together, it will help your color grade so that you can magnify some of these things or take away from some of these things to create the specific cinematic look that you're going for.
Okay, so here we are finally going over a cinematic grade. So in the previous lesson, you learned about a lot of the different traits, and now we're going to go through here. And before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about the overall color correction or grading process that you have with clients. Or a lot of times it's also good if you're grading your own film, or maybe you're working with friends and you're grading their films. The first thing I typically do when I get a call or an email from a client is I ask to see the film, and then I also ask to see some reference stills, some images, some photos, anything that can inspire the look or that will show me the look they've been going for. This can even be paintings. Most people send photos or stills from movies that they like or movies that inspired their movie and their look. For example, some people might send me stills from the movie Drive or Royal Tenenbaums or whatever movie they like. I like looking at those, and the reason that I do this is because a lot of times when a client emails and they tell me that they want them to look vibrant or happy or saturated, a lot like, say, the movie Amelie, for example, they typically might have a different idea than I have, and just to get on the same page, I ask them, send me the stills from the movies that you like, that you want for your film, and that way I know what you mean by vibrant, happy, gritty, sad, moody, dark, cinematic, whatever that might be, and then that helps me get on the same page with them, and from there we do what's called a spotting session or a look session, and all that is they come in, it's typically the director of photography, and we sit down, we go through the film, we talk about the film, they tell me their ideas, and for each scene, we might set up a kind of base look for that scene or the film. Typically, this is for the more larger major scenes. Sometimes it's for every scene. It really just depends on how much work we think we need for establishing a look for that film. And so then another thing you want to do, typically you obviously want to check out what the film looks like. And this is kind of going back to the previous lesson where I talked about cinematic traits. So if a client comes to me and says, oh, I want my film to look very cinematic or very film-like, I have to look at it. And this, for example, if I see something like this, where it's obvious that they picked a long telephoto lens, zoomed in, they have shallow depth of field, I can see the background's in focus, it's a nice composition, I can tell they framed everything, and they're working on, say, for example, here, it was well composed, they thought a little bit about their lens selection, for example, good set dressing, wardrobe, the lighting's all there. So this is what I mean by a film that kind of has that cinematic look already baked in there. You can't really take a movie or anything that was shot, say for example, something like this, very little about this is cinematic. This is the kind of example where, like I mentioned before, you can tell they basically turned on their camera, pointed it at a subject, and hit record. You can tell there wasn't much thought in lens selection. It's got a little bit of a deep depth of field. The compositions are just very kind of plain and boring in comparison to something like this or like this, for example. So again, what I'm trying to say is part of that cinematic look is baked into the film. And that helps dramatically when you're creating that look, because rather than kind of fighting against an image that doesn't look good and you're doing a lot of extra adjustments to try to get it there, you have something like this where you kind of have a little bit of a head start and you can make something look really like a movie. All the movies you see that you love, all the movies and looks that you love, it's because something was shot like this. So my tip to you, if you're shooting your own films, is to really learn the cinematography, learn the lighting, the lens, the composition, everything that I mentioned in the previous lesson and more, because that is honestly probably 50 to 70% of creating a cinematic look. From here, all we're doing is dialing in the contrast, the highlights, the style, the colors, the tones, the grain, and then we have other tools that can kind of help accentuate that look too. So here is, for example, the grade that I made for this shot. Okay, I'm going to go through all the different steps that I made. And so what you can see is first here, we're going to start off with the primary. Okay, so this is the original image, and the first thing we did, well, actually, first of all, okay, so before we go over the different steps that it took to create that look, I just want to go over how this film was shot a little bit. So as you can see, this clip is very washed out, very flat, very desaturated, and that's because it was shot in log. For those of you that don't know what log is, basically when you're shooting a film, you have the option to shoot it in just whatever normal camera profile that camera has. If you're shooting on, say, a Canon digital SLR, it might be called vivid, it might be called flat, it might be called standard, something like that. And what that basically gives you is added dynamic range for that image. And again, what dynamic range means is basically how much information do I have to work with when I'm adjusting something. To use this other shot as an example, that's how this was shot. This look is baked into this image, okay? So I have very little to work with. If I want to bring this down a little bit, I can, but you can see it starts to look a little bit fake, a little bit, pushed too far. If I, for example, saturate this, you can see very quickly the skin tones start looking a little too saturated. And so without getting too deep into that, I'll probably definitely make some course about that later. But without getting too deep into that, it basically means that when you shoot in a log setting, you have more information to work with, and color correcting will be easier, and a lot of different effects will be easier. So if your camera has a log setting, definitely use that. And if it does not, then use the flattest setting that your camera has. Okay, so now we're back here. And so the first step that I did is the primaries. You usually want to start off with the primaries, and what I did is that was the initial node. Okay, basically what these nodes are different steps that you take in creating your grade. And for this initial node, we went from point A to point B. And all that I did here was drop the shadows, raise the highlights a little bit, added contrast. I'll go over in detail here in a little bit, but just kind of giving you the quick overview of what was done to this image. I dropped the shadows as well, which is kind of like the lower end of the blacks. For example, this shoulder is a shadow, this is a shadow, any dark areas are usually the shadows. And that's basically what I did. Okay, and I basically shaped this image to look that way. So we went from here and really dropped down the look, because for this here, we wanted it to look very, again, cinematic, dark, kind of moody. This is a little bit of a tense scene where this father's kind of making the kids breakfast and they kind of fear their father, and so it should have a dark, kind of creepy, scary look to it. And then the second one, which again, this was called a primary look. Primaries are typically when you make adjustments, general adjustments to the image. And I made a second primary adjustment, which was just this, bring in a little saturation. To be specific, what I did was added color boost. And what color boost does compared to saturation is it basically uniformly increases your saturation across the board. So the skin tones saturate the same, the shadows, the highlights, the midtones, the entire image. And then color boost is in other programs like Lightroom or Photoshop, things like that. It's something that's typically called vibrance or a smart color kind of tool, to where this only saturates the least saturated parts of your image. In most cases, that's something like the darker areas, the shadowy areas, and it kind of helps create a little bit more natural look when you're increasing the saturation. Now, that doesn't mean that you never use saturation. Honestly, you probably use this more times than not. But again, for this look, because I want this image to not be super saturated like a commercial, I did color boost and brought it from here to here. Okay, and then next is when we start getting into the secondaries. Secondaries is basically when we start making fine adjustments. For example, when you start doing things like selecting only the skin tone, or selecting only the back wall, or only his shirt, or only, you know, parts of his hair, or part of this shoulder here. Those are typically secondaries when you do keys, mats, and that kind of thing. So for this, I started with the secondaries, and I basically brought up the greens that were in this wall based on how it was shot. You can see before, after. And that's basically what I did with the secondary, just to kind of give that background a little bit more of a green, kind of creepy look to it, make it look a little bit more unhealthy, and it also helps kind of separate his face and his skin tones from the background. And again, here's the original, and then that's with a little bit of green added to it. And then I added a secondary here. This is where we again start doing fine tuning, and I basically created a little window right here, and just kind of gave that a little bit of a boost to kind of, again, accentuate the lighting and separate him from the background a little bit. You can see it's starting to take shape. Another secondary here. I brought up this side of his face, the highlights here. And you can see that combining these two, it kind of helps add a dimension to the shot. So all of a sudden now we have a little bit of a highlight in the background here. We have a highlight, and it just looks that much better. And then so from here, I was pretty happy with it, but I kept going a little bit more. I went into the effects. And basically what I did here was just simply add grain. Okay. Like that. And if I zoom in, grain's a little bit harder to see, so here's before, no grain, grain. And you can see, usually when you add grain, it also kind of gives it a little bit of it kind of gives it this micro contrast boost and makes your image look a tiny bit darker. Okay, and then here, so I created this window here. And you can see that I made it super soft, and right now it's only affecting the parts of the image that you can see. So it's only affecting this area here, and this area is very lightly. Okay, and again, full screen. And basically I kind of made him go a little softer out of focus, and also this kind of back corner. This is one of those things that's very subtle. But I really just did this to kind of show you the kind of tools that you have to kind of accentuate the depth of field, the out of focus look to something. Okay, and that's something that's just a small adjustment. And then typically your last note is kind of what someone might call the look, the final adjustment, or last looks, the polish, the look adjustment. And what I did for this one here, it was just a matter of, do I like this luminance level or brightness level, or do I want to go a little bit darker? And typically for these kind of final looks adjustments, it's where I kind of leave it up to the client to decide, do you like something like this or a little brighter? Very small changes, but if you think of the entire scene looking like this, or the entire scene looking like this, then obviously that'll make a big difference. And sometimes this is kind of like where you play with things. You might increase the contrast a little bit more. You might cool down the scene a little bit more, or might warm it up a little bit more, do things like that. And so those are the looks. I'll kind of turn them off again and kind of show you what they look like. Okay, so here's the easiest one to notice. And then for these, I'll kind of go into full screen, saturation or color boost. That's the secondary, the background, I had a little saturation, really boosted the greens is what I did. Okay, and specifically what I used this tool for is if we go here to the kind of custom curves, I went into this hue versus saturation. And basically what hue versus saturation does is you click on a color. For example, I clicked on the green background and it selects that color. If I click on his face, you can see it selects the reds or orange. And I could increase saturation on his face or decrease it more if I wanted to. And that's how I did the background. And then again, this one was color boost. This was the background, which again was simply something as easy as creating a window, which you feather, almost like putting a light up, and that gives a little pop to that highlight in the background. Same thing here, window, it's feathered, and then gives that little bit of a boost. And we've seen the grain, all of these different steps, and then I'll kind of just add this. There we go. And so these were all the different steps that I took to create this look, or to magnify the cinematic look that's already baked into the image. And so those are all the different steps that I took to take this image from here to here, with primary, secondaries, effects adjustments with grain, and kind of adding a final polish image to this. Okay, so from here, I kind of graded this one just to kind of give you an overview, an idea of kind of the steps you would take based off the image. Now we're just kind of going to quickly grade the rest of the scene. This is a pretty easy scene just because it's basically composed of his close-up, this wide shot, his close-up, in this close-up. So it's basically 4 shots. And what I would do from here is then basically copy that look across to the other shot. So something that easy. I basically selected the shot and right-clicked on the graded shot, hit apply grade, and it pastes that look over. And that's basically it. So another thing about that, the reason that that works so well is, again, because this was well shot. There's a lot of times where, let's say on the day of the shoot, let's say it took you 6 hours to shoot the scene, and for example, maybe this was shot in the morning, and then by the time you got here it was really late. That's what makes shots not match. That, and also not having consistent lighting. So a lot of times, even within the same shot, what I'll see is that I'll take this look, for example, paste it to the exact same setup, and they don't match. And the reason that that is because either the lighting was inconsistent. For example, maybe they just used window lighting. Maybe that's all. Maybe this was shot with natural lighting, or maybe they did set up a few lights, but maybe halfway through the shoot they changed the light. Maybe they changed the color temperature. Maybe they moved the light forward, maybe back. Maybe they, again, were using a zoom lens and they zoomed in a little bit. Something as simple as zooming into a shot a little bit, or zooming out, or changing, the aperture, or any sort of camera setting can make shots not match. And so that's why when you're shooting, you want to make sure that you're consistent across the board, your camera settings stay consistent, your lighting stays consistent, and that way that makes the post-production phase be as easy as this. So here's another shot. Again, I'm just right-clicking, apply grade, and here's one where you can tell it needs to be adjusted a little bit, simply because he's kind of taking over the frame. We only see a little bit of him, so this is a good example of what I was just saying. It makes this look a little too dark, but we'll get to that in a little bit. And again, I'll go here. And again, I'm just kind of going through this to kind of show you how I'm doing it. You can also select multiple shots and do the same thing like this, which is obviously the faster way. Also, a lot of times in DaVinci Resolve, if you have shots that are of the same clip or of the same take, let's say all these shots were take 3 on that day, you basically will grade one shot and it'll automatically ripple to the other shots, which is pretty cool. In this situation, this is not the case, but just so you know, a lot of times grading can be even that easy. So I think, again, here we can go up to light box up here in the top right. This is a great way to kind of get an overview of the entire scene. One, it helps you look for shots, like if I want to find more shots of this guy, which I don't see any. But it kind of also helps you kind of see the color palette and if the look is staying consistent across the board. Like here, I notice that it's a very contrasty, dark, moody, kind of green look to everything, which is good. So I can see that I've graded all of his shots. So now I'm actually going to maybe jump to his shot next. And I'm going to try, again, if the lighting is somewhat consistent on the day of the shoot, you should just be able to right-click and look at that. Okay, now I understand this is looking extremely easy. Okay, and I understand that a lot of your projects will not be this easy, but the point that I'm stressing is how important cinematography is, preparation is, set dressing is, lighting. You do not necessarily create a cinematic look in the grading suite. You create a cinematic look from the first day of production, preparation, all the way through to color correction. Color correction really just shows and accentuates what's already been done. Okay, and again, I'll just toggle between the two. You can see it's working. I honestly did not expect it to work that well. Again, I'll just select these two, right-click, and we are going to make other adjustments as we're going, but I just kind of want to show you how easy things can be when things are shot well, and that's actually why I brought these guys in, because in a little bit I'm going to show you how hard it is and what can or can't be done when you have something shot like this. And I'll just select that one, and great, and I'll go back into the Lightroom, and you can see the look that's developing, dark, deep shadows, looks great. And you can also, by the way, apply things here. So I'm just going to select this guy. And it sort of works. Okay, and in a little bit we're going to go through and kind of fine tune this thing. And this is not a close-up, but I'm just kind of curious. Well, there you go. Here's what great cinematography can do for you. This actually is not bad. I'm actually going to undo that. And now I am just going to see what's left. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to select all the wide shots. Okay, so now I've selected all the wide shots, and then I'm just going to apply this to all of them, even though it won't be perfect, but you're starting to see what this film looks like. There we go. Oh, I missed this one. And then we're just going to kind of toggle through all of the different shots and make small adjustments. So here, I'm just going to kind of scroll through. And one thing that I don't like about this shot here is how I think the shadows are maybe a little bit too dark. So I'm just going to raise them a tiny bit. Maybe, and By the way, I'm hitting Command F to go into full screen. And I think that looks better. We can see a little. We definitely want this again to be a kind of dark, gritty scene. Okay, full screen, before, after, and now we're just kind of getting into personal taste a little bit. I'm going to, you may think different, I'm going to kind of just go with this brighter one. Okay, and again, here we go. I'll maybe pick all these. And then apply grade. And we should see them all kind of get a little bit brighter. And what I did here basically is this before was at a -7. I brought it up to a 4. Now I'm kind of jumping through to make sure. Okay. Apply grade. And back in the light box. And here's the grade. So, okay, so here we are again in the light box. Okay, and now we will just simply go through here and jump through the different clips just to make sure everything is matching, and so far so good. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you right now are probably saying that this is probably shot on very expensive cameras and this and that. This scene was actually pretty cheap to shoot, but again, they just kind of prepared a lot for it. Okay, and that's this shot that was maybe a little dark. And again, in the primaries, and the reason I'm sticking and making this adjustment in these primaries is because that's where those kind of overall adjustments to the entire image are. If I was adjusting just the green background, that's kind of where this guy is. Okay, so I'm going to go here. And I'm just going to raise the shadows a little bit because the shadows look a little dark. And that's probably good. Okay, we can see that's matching here. And again, there's the consistency there where I can make similar adjustments across the entire scene because of how consistent this was shot. Okay, so from here, now we are going to go to the other clips because obviously I took my time creating this image, and I'm going to go through the other ones and just kind of make adjustments because obviously this will not translate 100%. I think overall, for example, this is where we started. That was the first node. And happy with that. And then this is the second node, which is just, again, the color. And then the third node, which is the green background. I see that's happening up here as well. So that looks good. And then this guy here is when we start getting into these windows that mean nothing. And I don't see any use for this, so I'm actually going to delete that. Maybe we'll add something else. This is the other window. Don't need that. This is the grain. Command F. Do need that. There's off, on, off, on. There we go. And don't need that. This is the slight diffusing blur effect. And then I do need this. It's a little bit darker. That looks good. Okay, so here's where we are now. You could consider this that initial look with those extra things removed. So as I'm looking at this frame, and he's kind of just putting the plate down here, again, at this point, it's all just a matter of your taste, you know, whatever you want to do to the image. I feel like we've already kind of established a look for this scene, and now it's a matter of adding additional secondaries, because this was the primary, where we took it from here to here. The largest adjustment, I'd say probably 70 to 80% of the adjustment is typically in the primaries, because that's a global adjustment to the entire image. And then this is kind of the polish when you start getting into the secondaries, like the green background, the highlights we did on him, the highlight here, the highlight in the background, for example. So let's bring him back out. And really this is where we just kind of get creative. So I like the grain, I like this. So now I'm going to add a window, clicking here. Okay, and then I'm going to place this window over his head. I kind of want to see a little bit more of him. Shift H is the keyboard shortcut to show us what the window is affecting. Shift H is to turn it off, or if you like clicking, you can do this up here, but I like keyboard shortcuts. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the gain or the highlights. Really this is the highlights here, but what I'm going to do now is just raise him a little bit. He's going to eventually sit down, but I just want to add a little something there. And again, it's such a soft window. He's really just kind of landing into the window. If you wanted to get very picky with it, you could track that window, but for this situation, I don't think that's that necessary. Again, that's kind of all I'm doing, just adding a little something there. And honestly, I'm pretty happy with this image overall. Yeah, I think it looks pretty good. Yeah, if we wanted to play with the look though, I might go over to the polish node here and just play around with it. So let's maybe do that really quick. Also, typically I do work on a control panel, but for this, obviously I click around with the mouse just to kind of show you what's being done. And so for this, we will just do something like, maybe we'll go to color temperature, and I'm just gonna take the look and cool it down a little bit. And I'm not gonna change the whole scene. This is just simply to show you where you might go and make that kind of change. Again, everyone has a different opinion. You might like this better, you might like this better. That's actually part of color correction that can drive you crazy, and it's why you do need to take breaks. It's because as you're going through making all these adjustments, playing with it, it can all start to look the same, and that's why you do want to walk away every now and then and come back so you can get fresh eyes and decide if you actually do like this better or this better. Okay, and do that. Another thing I can maybe do is say, you know what, I'm going to maybe sharpen the image a little bit. I went here. This is the kind of blur window where I could blur the whole image if I wanted to. And then if you go down in the opposite direction, it kind of sharpens it a little bit. So I'm just going to do a very soft sharpening. And see a little more detail here. And again, I'm just kind of playing around with the tools just to kind of show you kind of when you're working and creating a grade, how you just really, it's not a set formula. It's just a matter of how things were shot, what the look is, what you're going for, being creative, playing with the tools a little bit, and seeing what you like and don't like. And after a while, you'll kind of develop a taste or a style for things that you like, and different tools to try out. So for example, in this situation, I kind of do like the sharpness. We could go in and say, oh, I only want to sharpen this table area or anything, but because it's a wide shot and it's kind of soft light coming in through this window here, I think in this situation, that extra sharpness kind of adds a little something. So we can see the detail in his face and the detail in his face, which I also know this is the main character of the film, so we definitely want to add a little extra something to that. Okay, so back to the light box here, and I'm just going to select all of these shots again. And then I'm just going to reapply that grade. Quick way to make that adjustment to all of the different shots. So now all these shots have that new adjustment that I made. Command F. That has that additional sharpness. And so just adding these small details one at a time is what takes you from something like this to this. And actually, you know what I'm going to do, again, just to keep showing you different things, is I like this crack here. So I'm going to bring it out. See if I can bring it out without it seeming a little too fake. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit technical. So the way these different nodes work, it's sequential. So I create my primary, and then this node number 2 makes the adjustments on top of whatever these were, and then the third node makes the adjustments to this, and we kind of go down. If you know Photoshop, it's kind of like the layer system where every new node makes adjustments to the previous node. And the reason I bring that up is because right now you can see that this is very black. You cannot see that crack at all. So if I were to say just add a node at the very end, and just to show you very quickly and try to brighten that up, okay, what I'm doing here, I can see it, but you can see it will probably bring out noise and different things like that. So what I want to do is I want to make adjustments to the cleanest, most original part of the image. And so what I mean by that is rather than, let's say even if I tried to make this work and feathered this, which it probably can, which by the way, at the beginning I mentioned dynamic range and the fact that this was shot log, so I have more dynamic range. That's exactly what I'm showing you right now, the benefits of dynamic range. Dynamic range is what's letting me grab that crack right there from the shadows. If this was not shot in log, this look would be baked in, as in this is the look of the image, and everything in that shadow would be completely gone. You would not be able to recover it. But because this was shot in log and they captured all of this data, I can go in and create a window and pull that up, okay? And again, what I'm seeing is basically it's a little bit messy, grainy, it'll be noticeable as kind of a window. So I'm actually going to delete this, go here to the first one, and I'm going to create something called a parallel node. So I'm going to hit Option P, or you can go into Add Parallel Node. Again, Option P is easier, okay? And let me clean this up a little bit. So what a parallel node does, as it's called, so think of this little dot here, this little square, as the original camera image, okay? this is not the original first adjustment. This is kind of what's on the camera memory card, what's on your hard drive, and then this is the first adjustment that's done to it. And then this is the next generation of adjustment, the next generation, etc., until I'm down to generation 5, where you're just kind of stacking these different adjustments one on top of the other, which is fine. But when you're trying to pull things from the shadows, for example, you typically want to go to the original source image, which is this, which is why I created a parallel node. And it's called parallel because it is making adjustments at the same level as this primary. And then this last node that I added, these two are on the same level, and they're adjusting the source image at the same exact time, on the same generation, you could say, versus this one, which is actually going through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different levels, or generations of quality, if you want to put it that way. So by doing this, I'm getting a cleaner window, okay? So I'm going to try this. And again, this is very, very dark, so we're just kind of, again, playing with this. Let me... Option D turns everything off. There we go. And I just want to position this in. I only kind of want to see the crack, so I'm going to start here. And let's see what this does. So I'm just going to gently raise the shadows here, 2 points. And this obviously, see, it's already kind of showing. It's probably too much, so I'm going to drop this back. I just want it to be very subtle, almost subconscious. See, there we go. Now we're getting somewhere. You can kind of see it there. And then I'm going to do the mids, maybe 1 point here. I honestly may not go any further than that. I actually may. And also, for the record, I would usually maybe do more of like a shape or something, but I'm kind of showing you here one of the quicker ways to do this. So I think you'll get the idea. You could go in there and kind of draw a nice little shape to grab all of this, maybe some of this, or another way to do this, which I actually might do instead, is I'm going to actually do this whole wall and feather this and bring it back. And now I'm going to go full screen, Command F, and okay. So anyway, I honestly think I probably like no crack, so I'm just going to actually leave it off. But again, that's what we're doing. We're just kind of messing around with the image. This is kind of what you do as a colorist. You play with the image, you bring out this, you might bring out this armchair. All these little details, before you know it, help you craft an image that looks beyond simply doing a primary grade. Because what most people do is they do what's the equivalent of a primary, where they just make one universal adjustment to the image, and then they're kind of done. And that's all that's all they did to the image, and then it doesn't look that great. So again, I'm going to go quickly through this guy here. Again, Option D, we went from here, looks good. This is the color boost, looks good. The background looks good. This we don't need, delete. This is actually the highlight of the face, so I'm actually just going to rotate it for him. There we go. And Shift H again to do that. I'm going to just kind of reshape it for him. Shift H to turn it off. Full screen. I like that. And what I want to do too, I really want to see his eye. So now I'm actually going to sharpen. Oh, it looks like I already did sharpen it, but I'm going to sharpen it more. I sharpened it on the other guy. Here. I want to see a little bit, actually. That's better. That's how the image originally was. Boom. And it helps kind of see the beads of sweat and everything too. Looks great. The grain. Looks great. This is the kind of blur effect. I'm going to remove that. And then again, this is the final polish. I'm going to keep him on the brighter side, so I'm going to delete that. And again, just to kind of wrap up soon, you can see how we kind of go into building a look. It starts off with how the image was shot, and then we go from the primaries to secondaries, make these small adjustments, which kind of, as they say, small things that make a huge difference. This is a good example of one. You know, a lot of people might, let me kind of show you. A lot of people would probably stop here on this image. And also, on top of that, maybe an image is not shot this well, and just by creating these additional effects, it kind of helps take your film to a different level that looks more cinematic and more polished. So now I'm going to take something like this before we wrap up. Completely different look. This probably was not meant to be cinematic at all, like this. completely different look. I'm going to attempt to make this look cinematic. Again, I've never touched this. This is actually just raw footage. This is a raw red file that's kind of stock footage that they have. And I'm going to try to do that. So the first thing I see about this image is that it's too bright. Okay, most images that you want to look more like a movie, they're not this bright. So, and it's also a very kind of wide, unfocused shot where obviously this is a focus, that's a focus. But we're going to kind of help make this look a little bit more cinematic. So what I'm going to do in my primary adjustment is the first thing I'm going to do is darken this a touch. Overall, this image looks pretty good. And I mean, it was obviously well shot. Okay. So that darkness level, again, this all comes to taste. And I'm going to then make this look a little darker here at the midtones. Here, and then the lift or shadows. I'm going to bring these down a touch. And again, if you're not familiar with these terms here, I would say my other course, not to do a plug here, but my other course, Intro to an Introduction with a Pro Colorist, I actually go over all of the different terms in the interface like gain, gamma, lift, contrast, highlights, shadows. So if you want to check that out, maybe this will make a little bit more sense if you're not familiar with lift, gamma, gain. Or you could call them shadows, midtones, highlights, but I think you kind of get the point that I'm just kind of making this a little bit darker and moodier. See, already you're seeing the original image. And now I'm going to increase the contrast. And again, this is all just kind of playing with it. So I'm going to do this. And what I'm looking at, by the way, is the shadows and the highlights all at once. And then I'm going to use this tool here called Pivot, which what it pivots is the contrast level. So for example, as I start adjusting, it's kind of a way of fine-tuning the contrast, whereas the contrast is, you could say, a more rough adjustment of the contrast. Pivot is where you fine-tune the contrast. So I'm going to do this. Again, this is just the primary. I'm going from this to this. Okay, and next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reframe this shot because this is too wide. I'm going to create a second node, go here to our sizing palette, and I'm going to zoom in. This was shot on the red, so I know I have the latitude. Actually, I want that out. I'm going to really zoom in. And in a typical film, you'd be surprised how much things are reframed and recropped for a lot of different reasons. It may just be that it was intentional that you shot a little extra wide and you meant to reframe it in post, or sometimes it's just an issue of like, once you see your shot after it's cut, you realize that for story purposes or for edit purposes, you maybe need something a little bit tighter. And so for here, I'm just kind of reframing her a little bit. There, I'll just do that. Again, I could play with it forever, but okay, so we'll just call this the primary adjustment, that we did this, and then we cropped it, we reframed the shot a little bit. I have an issue with her face. It's, again, not sharp enough. So I'm just going to create a window right here, Shift H to see what I'm adjusting. And I can do two things too. I can, that's too much. This is a very strong tool, by the way. Just a little bit goes a long way. You see, because her eyes are a little soft. So I'm just going to do that there. Okay. And actually, I'm going back to the primary, and I'm going to actually cool this off a little bit. So I'm going to go into color temperature. And again, typically something that looks cinematic is not so warm and vibrant. It looks, right now, that image looks very much like a typical video image, and I'm trying to take that away. So I'm cooling this off. We started here. We're going here. And I'm really going to create a look. So I'm going to really push this like that. Okay, you can see it's starting to look like something. And now that we have that, I'm going to maybe push the contrast again. Again, it's all a matter of taste. Make it very contrasty, and I'm actually going to desaturate a little bit. And I'm really just making this look up as I go, because typically when you have story and everything else to go with it, that kind of helps. But I'm just going to make something that looks good. And then these highlights up here are bothering me a little bit, so now I'm going to do that as a secondary, Option S, to create an additional node, or again, the slower way to go up here and click on that. And highlights, HL right here, is when you want to adjust just the brighter parts of the image, like light bulbs and reflections and that kind of thing. So I'm going to take that, and that's too much, obviously. Okay, there we go. And you can see that because this image was not meant to look cinematic, it wasn't shot that way intentionally, it takes more work to get there, which again goes back to preparing ahead of time and shooting things a certain way to make it seem this easy, okay? This will never look like this because it wasn't shot with that mindset. This, again, is a situation where they probably, turned on the camera, picked a certain aperture because they were doing a camera test, and that's what this is. So we're basically trying to make a camera test look cinematic. We're trying to make a camera test look cinematic, and we're going to see how far we can go with it. But again, by knowing those cinematic traits and knowing that, a movie that might be typically a low-key, darker, how certain contrast levels look, how certain shadows levels look, and really knowing different things that you can fine-tune, like the depth of field, reframing, the lighting levels, the color temperatures, all these things you can know to push you in a direction to make it look a little bit better. So I'm going to try something now because I really want to focus on her. So I'm now going to make a vignette. Oops, hit that. Really soften this here. And again, I am only darkening the outside, so I'm going to make a little bit of a vignette. I think we're getting somewhere. And as you can see already, calling this a cinematic image is much more accurate than this, which is where we started. It's bright, it's soft, it's very orange, it almost looks overlit in comparison, compared to something a little bit more like this. And actually, I sharpened that. Now I want to bring it up just a touch so her face pops a little with highlights. Okay, great. There we go. And then here I'm just going to, because this is a stationary shot that isn't moving, I'm going to maybe draw a little window here. And again, I don't want to make this super, I want to say accurate, because that's not how a lens does background blur. So I'm kind of going to do this rough window here. Shift H, soften this. And then click here to do the outside. And I'm going to now go to blur and blur that a little bit. There you go. I've suddenly changed the depth of field a little bit. This was distracting. Now it's not as distracting. Let's see how far we can push it. That's maybe much. Anyway, that's just a matter of taste. I'll just say leave it here. And then I will, as the last thing, again, we could stay on this forever. I'm going to add a little bit of gradient. I'm just going to add just 50% and see what that looks like. Full screen. I could go with a little more. I'm just going to go to 100 so you can see it, because I know that if you're viewing this online, sometimes it takes a lot of gradient to be able to see it. That may be a little too much, but it may be fine. So anyway, I think you get the general idea. Again, let me undo all this. We started here. We reframed the shot, because also, remember we were here. Wide shot, doesn't really have a focus. We reframed, and then we did primary adjustment. Additional primaries with the highlights. Window, vignette. Sharpened her face and brought it up. Depth of field. There we go. Depth of field adjustment. And grain. Okay, so there you go. You see that we have done a lot of stuff. We created a cinematic look here, this grade here. We've talked about the different traits. We apply them to the other shots as well. And then we've kind of seen what doesn't work when you're trying to create a cinematic look. And then we've seen what happens when you take something that really wasn't meant to look that way, and you kind of apply those principles that we've learned, and you end up with something like this. It may not look perfect, it may not look like this, but that's definitely way better than starting here. And again, you could keep going, tackling this until you have something that looks pretty great. And I think we did a pretty good job with this. So, okay, so there we go. Great, and I'll see you in the next video. Okay, so that's our course. I want to thank you so much for taking it. I hope you learned a ton in this course. And I just want to say a few more things before we wrap up. Remember that whenever you're trying to grade a film, whenever you're trying to make it look more polished, whether this is going for the cinematic look or anything else, remember that it's always about a collaborative effort. It's about the colorist, it's about the DP, it's about the director.
And the best way to get the best look that you want for your film is to communicate with the creative forces, the DP, the director, anyone else that you can think of that can bring something to the table. Any of the projects that have always come out the best that I've ever graded, they've always been the projects where I sit in a room with a director of photography, with a director, and we try different things, we experiment. We might start off at point B and end up with something very different. And it's really about remembering that it's about the story. What can I do to make the story better? Not necessarily what's the coolest look or the hippest look or something that's popular at the time. If you want to be the type of colorist that creates original looks that maybe set certain trends or that have people walk up to you and say, oh, how did you do this? How did you create this? How did you create that? That typically comes from experimenting, trying different things, knowing your lenses, knowing the history of film, knowing why certain looks are popular and why they're not. And this will help you become a much more successful colorist in your career.
Hi everyone! As you probably know by now, my name is Dandan and I am a professional filmmaker whose work emphasizes cinematography and deep storytelling. So in my own filmmaking journey, the biggest mystery to learn was color grading. Even as someone who works as a professional in the industry, color grading is such a secret world. How do you make images that look like this? Although there are many courses out there that'll teach you the technicals of using color grading software, like DaVinci Resolve and Adobe Premiere Pro, there are no courses currently that'll teach you comprehensively the art and creative process of color grading, how to see subtle shifts in color and use them to serve your story to make your film more cinematic and powerful. So this course will open up the secret world and teach you both the art and science of color grading for filmmaking. First, we will train our eyes to see color in subtle ways. Then, we will step back and look at how you can use color intentionally to serve your story. And finally, we'll go over the technicals, where I will teach you a comprehensive, professional method you can use with Adobe Premiere Pro to translate your envisioned look into your film. By the end of this course, you will have all the knowledge and a complete roadmap needed to color grade your film, and have yet another powerful tool in your filmmaking toolkit to craft beautiful, strong films. Let's get started. So for this class, you'll need a few things. First, you'll need to download a free trial app of VSCO on your phone, which is basically a more extended, artistic version of Instagram. You will need a photo shot in daytime with patches of black and white. For the technical part, I'll be demonstrating with the Adobe Premiere Pro Lumetri panel, which most of you all probably have, but all of these principles can be applied to any color grading software like DaVinci Resolve. Part 1, Seeing Color. So the first step to any good color grading is to train the eye to see subtle shifts in color in your image. Rather than just putting a whole color wash to your entire image, which will look freaky, you'll want to distinguish between putting color in the highlights, midtones, and shadows of your image. So let's talk about those. If you look at the entire exposure or brightness range of your image, highlights represent the parts that are the brightest, midtones are the parts that are in between, and shadows are the parts that are the darkest. In color grading, you specifically tweak the colors, contrast, and saturation of these 3 different areas to get a specific look. If you use LUTs or Instagram filters, they are basically color grading templates that designate certain colors, contrast levels, and saturation levels in the highlights, midtones, and shadows. For example, the classic Hollywood look has orange highlights and teal shadows. Seeing these subtle color differences is undoubtedly the trickiest part of color grading and one that takes time to develop. However, I created this exercise to kickstart your eye training. For this exercise, you'll need a free trial of VSCO downloaded as an app on your phone. You'll also need the photo you chose, shot in daytime with normal exposure levels and white and black spots in the image, like this one I'll be demonstrating with. So once you've downloaded the VSCO app and have your chosen photo, open the app up on your phone and import your photo by pressing the plus icon on the right, clicking on the photo and hitting import. Then, make sure that single photo is highlighted and open up the filters workspace by clicking this icon on the bottom. Right now you should be on the single photo view, but if it's not, you can change it by clicking the little Polaroid icon on the left and hit the one with the multiple grids. Now you will see your photo applied with all these different types of filters. And if you scroll down, you will see that there are many, and they are actually color-coded by filter families, which have similar characteristics. For example, the KPs in Lilac here all belong to one filter family. Choose one that looks a little stylized, and click Save. And save it to your camera roll. Do this for a minimum of 4 filters that are different from each other. Now you can open up your camera roll, which will have your original photo and your recently saved versions of this photo with the filters applied. Click on one and notice what is happening to the image from the original. With each filter, ask yourself these questions. Number 1, what is happening to the highlights? Number 2, what is happening to the midtones? Number 3, what is happening to the shadows? Number 4, what is happening to the contrast levels of the image? And number 5, what is happening to the saturation levels of the image? I've saved 4 different versions of this photo, each with a different filter, and will compare them side by side, going over our main questions. For the first example, as you can see, the highlights turn magenta and the shadows turn blue. The darker the shadow, the darker the blue becomes. The midtones are in a lighter shade of blue. The saturation levels seem to be more intense, and the contrast looks like it stays at similar levels. With the second example, here, the highlights, shadows, and midtones look like they've stayed the same. The saturation levels have decreased, which gives the original image a sepia wash. The contrast levels seem to have reduced as well. Version number 3. Here, the highlights and midtones look like they have stayed the same tone. The shadows have gone more in the blue direction. The saturation levels have clearly increased, and the contrast levels have increased as well. Version number 4. Instantly, you can sense that the image feels cooler. The highlights have become a tad brighter, as you can see in the dog's coat. The midtones took on a green tinge, and the shadows are more green. The saturation has increased a little bit, and the contrast levels are similar. Here are 2 bonus comparisons. Version number 5, the highlights have taken on an orange tone, the midtones also took on an orange tone, and the shadows look like they've stayed similar. The saturation levels have increased, and the contrast looks like it has increased slightly as well. At first glance, the image feels cooler. The highlights in the cool range appear to have taken more of a blue tone, while the highlights that are in the orange range seem to have kept their warmth. The midtones appear to have taken on a blue tone, while the shadows appear to have moved in the violet direction. The saturation levels have increased, and the contrast levels have increased slightly as well. Don't fret if you are unsure what is happening specifically in your image. This skill takes time to develop, and it'll develop even further as you actually engage in the color grading process that we will address later. For now, it's just important that you recognize the differences between the highlights, midtones, and shadows, if an image is low contrast, neutral, or high contrast, and if an image has low saturation, normal saturation, or high saturation. Now that we've prepared the eye to detect the important parts of color grading in an image, let's talk about how we can use color grading to serve our story. Before starting to color grade, ask yourself what mood, emotional themes, or psychological undertones you'd like to enhance in your story through the color grading. Build a lookbook of stills from films that are similar to your visions and critically look at their color grading choices. For example, do you want your film to have a classic blockbuster feel with teal shadows and orange highlights? Do you want it to have a vintage, summery nostalgic feel with warm colors and low contrast? Do you want it to have punchy blacks and high contrast? Do you want it to have a muted feel with low contrast, milky blacks, and low saturation? Do you want it to look natural? Thinking about these intentions is critical because they'll act as a guiding compass as you actually delve into the color grading process later on. So now comes the technical part of the color grading process, where I will show you a 5-step method you can use to translate your vision into reality. For this process, I'll be demonstrating with Adobe Premiere Pro, and all the steps will be located in the Lumetri Color panel. The biggest mistake I've seen in filmmakers is that they tend to throw around their color grading haphazardly, dialing in the look as they go, which usually results in an overcooked grade. This is analogous to putting on too much makeup, which looks fake and detracts viewers' attention away from your story. So to avoid this, I'm going to present you all with a 5-step order of operations for color grading, which looks like this. Number 1, color correct. Number 2, match color. Number 3, fix skin tones. Number 4, add visual style. And number 5, polish. Alright, so to demonstrate step 1 with color correcting, I brought up 2 shots in sequence from Mickey's dog that I had a lot of trouble with in terms of color correcting. As you can see, the first shot is very underexposed, and it was actually taken on a different camera than mine by a B camera operator from up top. And this shot then goes into this one, which as you can see is also underexposed. So to set up our color interface, we are going to use the Lumetri color panel. First, you can find this by going to Effects and typing in Lumetri color. Then dragging this effect onto the clips that are problematic, which in this case is both of them. After you've dragged the effect onto your clip, then go to the color workspace. And as you can see, it's just much more conducive to any color work. You have the Lumetri color panel here, and here you have basic correction, which should look like any photo editing interface you find on your phone or on Adobe Photoshop. Here you can add in a LUT, which we will address in the later step. Here is your white balance, and here you can address the exposure, general contrast, highlight, shadows, blacks, and white levels, and also the saturation. So this one we're going to be using quite extensively, as well as the color wheels. As you can see, this gets more fine-tuned by breaking down the color and the luminance levels, or the exposure levels, of the shadows, midtones, and highlights. And these 2 panels are what we're going to use the most, but I will touch upon the other ones as we go along. So let's bring the shots back to a natural baseline. I'm going to go back to my basic correction panel and start with this clip. As you can see, it's very underexposed, and it was shot on a flat picture profile. So if you shot on a flat picture profile, the first step is to bring the contrast levels back by bringing the black levels up. So that looks like a good baseline contrast level. And we're now going to also bring back the exposure. Now that we have adjusted, we've brought the contrast level back and we have adjusted exposure, now let's deal with white balance. If your whites look a little off, what you can do is click on this white balance selector and click on a white spot in your image. And the software will automatically calibrate for any glaring white balance issues. Usually this works like a charm. Oftentimes, however, when you do the white balance selector, it can overpush your colors in certain directions that don't look quite natural. When I see this clip, however, the white balance still doesn't look quite right. If you find that this is the case, this is a time to play around. First, try with the basic correction, which will affect both the highlights, midtones, and shadows equally. I recommend adjusting temperature and pushing it in the opposite direction of the color cast. Or if that doesn't work, then working with the tint. And if that doesn't work, then you'll want to go into the color wheels and play with these until your colors look more natural, which is what I'm going to do. I want to push it in the more yellow direction, which actually looks pretty good. But as you can see, the shadows still look really blue, and the blacks, they don't look black. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my color wheels and match, and work with the shadows, highlights, and the midtones until I can get a more natural, even palette. So first, let's look at the shadows. They look very blue to me, so I'm going to push them in the opposite direction, in the orange direction. And as you can see, now the blacks look more black. And this sidebar that you see on the left is actually the luminance value, so it affects the brightness level. So here, I find that the shadows are still a little bit too bright, and I want to bring them down a little bit. So I'm just going to bring them down just a tad. And as you can see, it's a very subtle change, but the blacks now look more black. And that looks like a much better starting point. If I compare it with how it looked before, that's what it looked like before, and now it just looks so much better. So to recap, we first brought back the contrast levels from our flat picture profile. Then we adjusted the exposure, and then we adjusted the white balance. So now I'm going to color correct the second image, which as you can see also looks very dark. This was not shot on a flat picture profile, so I'm just going to go ahead and up the exposure levels until the brightness looks good, like that. And let's also play with the white balance selector. So there we go. So once you have looked through the individual shots and corrected them in terms of color and exposure, now you want to look at the shots in relation to the whole sequence and make sure that there are no shots that are breaking the sense of continuity in terms of the color and the exposure. In other words, you want to make sure that all the shots look like they were all shot in one environment from one camera in your sequence. So here we have the shot of Mickey as she finishes her match, And as you can see, these two shots don't really match. This one is much more warmer, and then it jumps to this one, and this one's much more cooler, and it feels like they were shot on two different cameras. So let's work on matching these shots. So when you match shots, you want to choose one as a reference image. And typically, you choose your wider shot because it has much more color information and sets the setting. So I'm going to go back to this wider shot, and a helpful tool is a reference window, which will pull a still from this shot, which you can use to compare as you are color grading the other shot. So to do that, go to Window and click on Reference Monitor. As you can see, now you have a very handy reference to use as you are adjusting the color of the other shot. And the side-by-side comparison shows that they're very different. So the first thing that I'm noticing is that this shot is a lot more cooler. So I'm just going to warm that up a touch, just like that. And as you can see, it's already matching a lot more than it did previously. So now I'm noticing that the blacks in this image, the blacks in the wide shot look very different from the blacks in this shot. The blacks in the wide shot still look like they have a blue tinge. And I actually prefer if the blacks look truly black. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to play with the shadows and reduce their luminance. So this shot also looks a tad bit more saturated. So I'm going to go to my saturation and I'm just going to reduce it a hair. And keep playing with the settings, namely the ones in the basic correction panel and the ones in the color wheels and match, until you create a sense of continuity that is believable as you cut in between these two shots. There we go. So that matches quite well. With shot matching, you don't need to match the color exactly from shot to shot. You just want to make sure that it's continuous enough so that we don't notice a jarring cut. However, it's really important that you do match the black levels really well. And to demonstrate why, I'm going to change the black levels of this shot so that the blacks are a little bit more milky. As you can see, when I jump from this shot to this shot, it's quite jarring, and it looks like the shots were taken from completely different environments. So you really want to make sure to keep an eye out for the continuity of your black levels. After you have created a neutral baseline and all of your shots match in the sequence, now is the time to tweak skin tones. So skin tones are the area in your image that you want to really watch out for, because if skin tones are off, then your whole image will look off. So here I have an interview shot, and we're going to check to see if his skin tone is normal. So to check whether your skin tones are in the natural range, there's a very helpful tool called the Vectorscope that'll help you see where you need to push the colors in your skin tones if they need any adjustment. So to do this, first open up your Lumetri scopes. And if you don't find it here, you can go to Window and turn it on by clicking Lumetri scopes. Make sure that the Vectorscope YUV is turned on, and it should bring up a graph that looks like this. This is basically a map of all the color values in your image. So to make that clear, for example, if I push the temperature way down to the blue range, you can tell that the color values in the image have all moved toward the blue quadrant in this Vectorscope. Likewise, if I move it towards the orange range, look what happens. The colors are changing in real time and moving towards the orange quadrant. So for skin tones, what is really fascinating is that no matter what your ethnicity is, all skin tones lie on this line between the yellow and the red quadrant called the flesh line. And so you'll want to check to see whether the skin tone in your image lies on that line. To do this, go to your effect controls and under opacity, create a little mask that will contain a sample of your skin tone. Then look at your Lumetri scopes, and you can see that it has isolated the color values of the masked area. And as you can see in this sampling, the colors of his skin are a little too much on the yellow range and they don't really hit the red quadrant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the colors a little bit more into this red direction by going to the Lumetri Color panel and going to Color Wheels and Match. Because skin tones are midtones, to avoid affecting the other colors in my image, I'm going to just push the midtones a little bit in the red direction until the values in the vector scope lie on the flesh or the skin tone line. Like that. There we go. It just took a very small change. And now when I go back and remove this mask, you can see that the skin looks much better, as does the whole image. This was before, and this was after. So go ahead and check your skin tones and tweak them as needed. And I will see you in the next step, where we will actually start playing with color to build a specific look. Now that you have your base grade and your skin tones all in check, you have a really good foundation to start playing with color and use it to enhance certain moods and tones of your story. So to approach color grading, there's an easy way and a more complex way. The easy way is to find a LUT or lookup table online, which is basically a color grading formula that you can apply right away that'll give you a specific look. There are tons of free LUTs out there, so if you go this route, definitely take time to look through and see, the different moods and styles available out there. Once you download a LUT, it's very simple to upload. In your Lumetri Color panel, you just go to Input LUT, and then Browse, and then choose one and see how it changes the look and the feel of your image. However, because this is a color grading course, I recommend that you first try to play with the different color parameters, especially the colors in the midtones, highlights, and shadows, to create a style while also training your eye to pick up these nuances. So for example, here I have the opening shot of the Mickey Doc. So what I'd like to do first is keep in mind the mood I'd like to enhance. So this is already pretty realistic, but I'd like it to feel a little bit more dreamy, as if you have entered into the past, and I'd like it to feel a little bit more mysterious as well. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to open up the Color Wheels and Match. And a good general rule of thumb is to incorporate color contrast, which is when there are colors on the opposite sides of the color wheel present in your image. For example, you could push opposite colors into the highlights and shadows. For example, as seen in the classic Hollywood look where they push teal in the shadows and orange in the highlights. So here I'm going to play around, and I'm going to push some blue into my shadows and see what that does. Cool. So as you can see, from the original, it already looks so different. And to me, this gives it a dreamy feel, which is what I'm looking for. Now let me try to push the highlights in the opposite direction, so I will push it in the orange direction and see what that does. I like how that brings out her face a little more than in the previous, and it also brings out the red in her eyeliner and on her lips. Now let's play with the blacks a little bit and see what that does. So if I lift the blacks a little bit, like that, it adds a touch of surrealism, which is what I like. And so, as you can see, when you color grade, you just make these very subtle changes to your image to see whether it pulls it in a direction that enhances the subplot or the feel that you are going after. As you play, you will see that your eyes will start to pick up the differences between the highlights, shadows, and midtones. And as you play, you'll notice that color grading really is an art of nuance. So go ahead and start playing with your color grading. If you have a reference look, pull that up and try to adjust your own colors, the contrast levels, and saturation of your image so that it matches the look that you are going after. For another example, I am going to use a more stylized reference from one of Wes Anderson's films. And I've pulled up the reference here, as you can see. And I'm going to try to match this shot that I have of the farmer to the color grading of this reference image. So let's start with the basic correction. And as you can see, it's really underexposed. So I'm going to increase the exposure. And comparing the two, you can tell that in the reference image, there are a lot more yellow tones, especially in the highlights, as you can see in the sky. This one's more cool, and this one has a yellow veil on it. So now I'm just going to be playing around with all of the tools that we've looked over already until these two images match. First, I'm going to address the temperature and warm it up a hair. And as you can see, warming it up didn't really do much because this image, when warmed up, it's a little bit more on the magenta side than on the yellow side. So I'm actually going to bring it back and play with the color wheels and match. So first I'm going to address the highlights because that's the most obvious to me, and I'm going to push it in the yellow direction. Like that. Then I can tell that the midtones and the shadows are also pushed in the yellow direction, so I'm going to play around and see whether that brings a closer match. Okay, we are getting there. As you can tell now, the highlights in the sky, they're almost the same, but the one on the reference image appears to be a little bit cooler. So I'm going to go back to the basic correction, and I'm just going to move it down a little bit, like so. As you can see now, the sky matches pretty well. I'm going to go back to the color wheels and match, and now try to match the grass a little more. The shadows seem to be a little bit darker, so I'm going to push it down. And there seems to be a tad bit of contrast. The highlights seem to be a little bit more pronounced, so I'm going to bump the exposure up a little bit. And there we go. So as you can see, the process is very similar. First, you have to ask yourself all of the questions we've been asking. What is the difference between my shot and the reference shot in terms of the colors and the highlights, midtones, shadows, the contrast levels and the saturation levels? And then you have to play with the basic correction and the color wheels and match until you get a good match. So these two I consider are a good match. However, if you want to take a hair bit further, I see here in the reference image that the highlights, there's a little bit of red undertones to them. So because I already like, where my highlights are already, and I don't want to affect the other parts of the image, now is a good time to use the curves. Curves are a way for you to get very precise. And so as you can see, the curves, there are 4 types. One is the luminance level, so this one is your basic exposure. And the way you read this curve is that the 0 point here are blacks. So this is the shadows, then the middle part is the midtones, and the upper part are the highlights, while the point up in the corner here represents pure white. So for example, if I added a point here and moved the bottom part, as you can see, it's only affecting the black levels, and it's raising the blacks, so the blacks are becoming less dark and you get less contrast. So you would use this luminance curve if you wanted to tweak the exposure or the brightness levels of very specific areas in your image. Then you have the red curve here, which affects the amount of red in the shadows, midtones, and highlights. And this is actually what I want to use a little bit to add a touch of red to the highlights. I'm going to add a point here and here, just so I don't affect the shadows and the midtones. I'm just going to add a little bit of red to the highlights, not by much. There we go. So right now, I see that the colors match really well after making that change. And you could do the same with the green and the blue channels as well. Now you want to go through all of your shots which have been color graded and stylized. And like in step 2, you want to make sure that they're cohesive within the sequence. Adjust any shots that break continuity. If you find that everything is cohesive, now is the time to add a film grain if you wish. And for those who don't know what film grain is, it's adding a little bit of grain detail to the texture of your image so that it emulates film stock more than digital. So if you're interested in this, I will show you how. To do this, you can download a film grain LUT or use a plugin for Adobe Premiere called Film Convert. If you have downloaded Film Convert, then you should find it in your effects panel. Here we go. And add it to the clip. Then to work with Film Convert, in your Effects Controls panel, the Film Convert Pro workspace should be there. As you can see, there are many things you can do. So here, there's all of these film stocks that you can choose from. As you can see here, it's already adding some grain, and you can control many things like the amount of grain. So 100% is full, 200% you can really see it, and it just looks like noise now. So adding grain can also be a fantastic way to create a binding element that creates more cohesion for all of your shots. Then, once you're finished, it's time to export. Since Vimeo and YouTube are notoriously known for having codecs that compress your footage so it loses a lot of color information, I recommend exporting your footage with Apple ProRes HQ, which is a bigger file size, or its lighter component, Apple ProRes LT. This will retain more color information than the standard .h64. Color grading is very subjective, and it's hard to say that if you push colors in this direction, then it'll create these emotional undertones for your story. It really comes down to trying a few color grading schemes and seeing if that fits your particular story. However, to help you get some ideas, I found a fantastic tutorial by The Verge, which provides a really great overview on some of the color grading schemes found in movies today.
Some film critics believe that you can oftentimes glance at a movie's color treatment and instantly tell its genre. Desaturated colors for apocalyptic films, blue, cold tones for horrors, fluorescent greens for sci-fi, yellow tones for film based in the desert, saturated, vibrant red tones for comedies. And for everything else? Blue and orange, blue and orange, blue and orange, blue and orange. Epic, blue and orange. Drama, blue and orange. Bio, blue and orange. What emotion are filmmakers trying to lead us towards with this pair of opposing colors? And every other color treatment for that matter. Consider the mood ring, the hues of emoji, or even aura photography. Like music in an elevator or a doctor's waiting room, color has the power to influence how we feel without our even noticing. Film directors have exploited our color connection for decades. In fact, there's a rulebook of emotions that colorists, the people who manipulate the colors of film, follow. Our response to color varies depending on culture and context, but here are a few examples of familiar emotional applications of color. Color grading is the process of applying this understanding of color and its power by altering and enhancing the color of a motion or still picture either electronically, photochemically, or digitally. Back in the day, filmmakers could only achieve a stylized look if they committed to using filters, or if they spent a ton of cash to alter specific colors frame by frame. You've seen It's a Wonderful Life, but have you seen It's a Wonderful Life in color? Now that everything is shot digitally, color grading is less expensive, more accessible, and flexible. O Brother, Where Art Thou was the first movie to be entirely digitally color graded. The story took place during the Great Depression, so cinematographer Roger Deakins applied a warm sepia tone to the whole movie to make us feel like we were in the dirty 30s. Since then, digital color grading has become a standard practice for filmmakers, and one color grading trend that seems to be taking over Hollywood is blue and orange. There are a lot of theories out there, but one leading theory is that this color treatment makes actors pop against the background. On the color wheel, skin tones are mainly in the orange range, and the complementary color of orange is blue. So when you take your orange toned actor and then push everything else into the opposing color range, this contrast leaves you with the Hollywood look. Now that you understand the basics of color grading and some of its more common uses, you can try for yourself using a variety of easy-to-use apps, such as the iOS app VideoGrade. We decided to test out these color grading theories with some of our own footage. We picked a shot and gave it different treatments to explore how much we could change the mood of the scene. You be the judge. Of course, it's not as important to know how to manipulate color as it is to know how color can manipulate you.
As a bonus lesson, I wanted to go over one more scope that could help you detect the color values of your image more quantitatively instead of just relying on your eye. So we've already addressed this vector scope, and now I want to show you something else that could be helpful called the RGB parade. So as you can see, you have red, green, and blue, and all of digital colors are comprised of a mix of these three colors, red, green, and blue. So this graph shows you the amount of each color in the red, green, and blue channels, with 0 representing pure black and 255 representing pure white. This is especially helpful when you are white balancing, because if things are properly white balanced, your red, green, and blue channels should look roughly the same. For example, if I pushed blue into the image, you can see that the blue channel went up, and that would give you an indication that you would need to normalize the image by bringing this channel down so that all of them are similar. Likewise, this can be incredibly useful for you to detect black levels. Remember, you really want to make sure that your black levels all match in the shots in a sequence. And look what happens when I crush the blacks. Did you see that? The channels then touch 0, and that means that there is pure black in the image. So if you use this parade as you go from shot to shot, you can monitor whether the bottom line of these three channels are roughly in the same position. On the other hand, 255 represents pure white. So if I overexpose my image, you can see that the red, green, and blue channels are clipped at 100, and this means that your image has overblown areas where there's lost digital information. Besides white balancing and matching black levels, using this parade can also help you see what is going on in a reference image that you choose, looking at its proportion of red, green, and blue, and seeing if you can replicate that in your own image. Congratulations on finishing this course. I hope that by now you feel like you have new seeing superpowers and a clear roadmap needed to color grade your film to empower your story even further. This skill will take time to develop, but if you keep practicing and following this method, you'll soon be able to see nuances in color and exposure and control them to expand your creative toolkit. Please post a before and after version of a still from your film on the class projects page so we can see what look you created and get inspired. If you have any remaining questions, please post them on the discussion page as I'm here to support you, and invite you to check out my other courses, like my popular Art of Revision course, which presents a powerful 6-step method to fix the common weak spots of your film, building its clarity, momentum, and power. Thank you so much for taking your time with me, and happy color grading! If you like this course, I invite you to sign up for my newsletter, where I share exciting updates, high-value insights, and curated inspiration. Link on my course instructor page.
What's up, my name is Dennis. I'm a freelance videographer based out of Hamburg, Germany, and I really don't want to waste any of your time. In this class, you're going to learn how to deal with white balance for video. Alright, so I know white balance is a complicated topic for any beginner. I know how much I struggled, and so in this class, you're going to learn not only what white balance actually is, or why you even want something such as color accuracy. I'm also going to cover a bunch of ways how to get good looking and accurate white balance, from the very beginner's way to the very elaborate professional way. Everything is covered. And then also, in case you might have messed something up on a shoot, or you deal with someone else's footage where they might have messed up a little bit, I'm also going to cover how to correct the white balance after the fact, and we can even see how far we can actually go, how wrong can it actually be, so that we can still fix it. And you will be able to fix your images after the fact in case you mess something up. So without further ado, if that sounds good to you, I would love to see you in my class. White balance is one of the key settings for shooting videos, you all know that. But it's also one that many people struggle with, and that was certainly true for me. In fact, I think it took me about 3 months into making videos already for clients until I even paid any attention to white balance. Today I know how fundamental a good understanding of white balance really is, and how important it is to get the image to look the way I want it to look. So let's first ask the obvious question. What is white balance? The simple answer, and all you really need to know, is white balance is a setting in your camera that tells the camera what white actually is. Let me explain. Think of something that you know for sure is white, like a white piece of paper. And now if I take this white piece of paper and shine an orange light on it, it looks orange. I still know that it is a white piece of paper, but it looks orange. And now the same thing could happen in the other direction as well. If I were to put a blue light on it, it will look blue, and so on. The camera doesn't know that the paper is actually white, and that's why there's a setting called white balance. We can use it to help the camera understand what actually is white, so that the camera can show it in its accurate color despite the color of the light that is shining onto the object. In fact, based on what the camera perceives as white, it also decides on how colors should look like. So white balance doesn't only mean accurate whites, it also means accurate colors. Now maybe you've noticed before that most typical lamps that people have in their homes, you know, those indoor lamps, usually have a very warm feel to it. They're not white. Conversely, our average hospital or science lab or something like this has a colder light that almost feels blue. The difference between warm light and cold light, very appropriately, is measured in color temperature. An orange light is also called warm light, and the warmer the light, the more orangey it is. And a blue light is a cold light, and the colder it is, the more blue it is. Color temperature is measured in Kelvin, and the relevant range for us filmmakers is probably somewhere between 1000 to 10,000 Kelvin. The lower the Kelvin number, the warmer the light. And the good thing is, there are some reference points that we all know that we can place on the scale of color temperature. Let's take a candle, for example. Candles are visually and even emotionally connected to warmth, and that also is true in terms of Kelvin. A candlelight is usually around 1800 to maybe 2000 Kelvin. So the fact that candles, or fires in general, feel warm and comforting is exactly also what the color temperature tells us. Then let's make it a tiny bit less warm. We have our typical indoor lighting, usually around 2700 to 3200 Kelvin. Those still feel warm to our human eyes, but it's not as warm as a candle. This specific color temperature range, by the way, is often referred to as tungsten light, especially in the context of photography or cinematography. Now, daylight at midday with no cloud coverage is usually somewhere around 5600 Kelvin, 5600 Kelvin. Now, this can change based on cloud coverage, the position of the sun, and a few other things, but for now, let's just remember neutral daylight is 5600 Kelvin. If we go up even higher, we find overcast daylight can be up to 7000 Kelvin, and a deep blue sky even up to 10,000 Kelvin. And the reason for that, by the way, is more in the blue of the sky rather than the actual sunlight. Another aspect of white balance is also the tint. Sometimes certain lights might have a tint in their color that shifts the image away from neutral whites. This is usually the case with cheaper LED lights, and needs to be corrected either in the white balance setting in camera or in post-production if you want to have clean and accurate colors. But for now, let's put some color temperatures next to each other with a reference object in the middle. What you see here in the frame is called a color checker. We will go into more detail later in the class on how you can use those, but those color checkers, and especially the left part of it, are really, really useful because they can help us correct white balance not only on set before the recording begins, but also in post-production. So here we have a couple of lights at 3200 Kelvin, 5600 Kelvin, and 6500 Kelvin. What a difference, right? Just a little reminder that this is the exact same gray card under the same exact lighting intensity. The only thing that is different with all those lights is the color temperature of the light. We can see that our 5600 Kelvin light is the one that really looks white. It is the most neutral in some sense. And the colors in the image are looking vibrant and natural and basically just the way they should look, right? The reason 5600 Kelvin looks neutral in this is because our camera is set to white balance at 5600 Kelvin. In other words, I told my camera that 5600 Kelvin is going to be the light that I use, and that is the way it should interpret white. All the other color temperatures behave relative to the white that we set in camera. Everything cooler than 5600 Kelvin will appear increasingly more blue and more cold, and everything warmer will appear increasingly warm and orangey. Understanding this opens up a whole new layer of control. I always used to think that I can only control the lighting, with the actual lights, but in fact the combination of lights and white balance gives me many, many more options for creative possibilities. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. How different color temperatures react to white balance settings. So in the last video, we learned that white balance is a setting in our camera that helps it to interpret whites and colors accurately based on the light that we use. We found out that the light that we match with our white balance setting will appear with accurate whites and accurate colors just the way it should be, and we have started off with a white balance of 5600 Kelvin. And the reason is that 5600 Kelvin, or daylight balance, is probably the most used white balance, at least in my day-to-day work. But more importantly, it's also the one that our eyes seem to operate on, at least more or less. They do adjust to lights much better than any camera could, and honestly I'm not 100% sure on how this exactly works, but daylight usually appears neutral to us. It doesn't have a blue tint, it doesn't have a orange tint, it just looks normal, just white. But now let's have a look at what happens if we leave all the lights just as they are, and the only change we make is the white balance from 5600 Kelvin to 3200 Kelvin. In other words, tungsten, which is another very common color temperature and white balance. And now what do we see here? We see that our 3200 Kelvin tungsten light no longer appears warm, it appears clean white, like the 5600 Kelvin before did. And everything to the right of it, to the colder side, just became more blue. The daylight no longer looks white, it also looks blue. That again shows that the color temperature always behaves relative to the white balance setting. With white balance, we can kind of set a new neutral from which the scale starts. Now, just to confirm, let's set the white balance to 6500 Kelvin and see what happens. And as expected, the 65,000 Kelvin light now appears neutral, and all the other ones to the left are increasingly warm. And remember, the lights themselves stayed at the exact same setting, so now with that knowledge, we know that we can use the combination of white balance and the color temperature of our lights to create basically all kinds of looks. In the next video, let's look at some creative ways that we can use it to our advantage, other than just merely having, accurate white balance. How to use white balance creatively and influence the mood of a scene. Alright, so in this video, I want to quickly touch on something that honestly had me a little bit confused for a while because I had not found much online about it as I researched myself for this class, and that is regarding the limits of correct white balance. Let's remember together one more time what white balance actually is. White balance is a setting in our camera that tells it how to correctly show whites as white. And in most cases, that is exactly what we want because that is how we see the world as well. If we go outside at daytime, something white will not suddenly appear orange, it will be white. But if you just think for a moment, you will notice that in fact, there are lots of situations where things that are white don't actually look white. So if we white balance to such a lighting situation, what we create might be accurate colors, but not at all an accurate representation of what we see as humans. And then the question might come up, if our final goal is to create realistic and natural colors, then accurate is no longer the be-all end-all. I think most of the confusion in my head comes from the fact that the sort of videos I produce are, educational content, YouTube content, corporate image films, event videos, interviews, weddings. In other words, videos that are usually not very strongly stylized and follow a more or less clean look that to a big degree relies on at least somewhat accurate colors. I want to give you an example of what I mean. Let's imagine a scene where the character is reading a book in the light of a candle, okay? It's a very cozy and warm scene, and the filmmaker intended to convey exactly that. Calm, warmth. Now, without being too biased, I think this shot looks pretty nice. It looks good. It looks real, and it looks the way it should look, right? There's just one problem. I just broke all the rules of white balance we just learned. Because what we've learned is that a candlelight should be somewhere around 2000 Kelvin, right? But this scene was shot with a white balance of 5600 Kelvin. And the reason is very simple. I wanted the scene to look the way it felt in reality, and also how I wanted the result to feel. And sometimes those can be different. For example, you can make a, in reality, cold situation feel warmer, and vice versa. But this was a warm light and I wanted it to feel warm. Here in comparison is the very same shot but with an accurate white balance of around 2000 Kelvin, and it does not at all have the same quality of mood, and it just doesn't work as well in my opinion. And that ultimately teaches us that while correct white balance is extremely important to learn, there are moments where we need to use this knowledge to break the rules and achieve the image we were actually going for. The desired end result dictates the setting, not the other way around. Sometimes we do want accurate colors, sometimes we want realistic colors, and sometimes those are the same, and sometimes they're not. And sometimes we want to exaggerate things or force a mood onto an image. Honestly, in the end, there are a lot of things we can do merely by the power of white balance. So in the next lesson, let's go through a couple of cool moods and scenarios you can create with the help of white balance. Create color contrast. Let's start out easy. I want to show you how to use white balance to create a nice and easy talking head scene with amazing color contrast without having any access to RGB lighting or something like that, just with the power of white balance. Now, knowing the theory behind white balance, we know that color temperature is a relative scale that is always based off of the white balance setting that we work with. In other words, we can basically change the perceived temperature of light by changing the white balance. So let's say you have a typical indoor lighting bulb at around 3200 Kelvin or 2700 Kelvin or something like that, and you have one video light that is daylight balance, so 5600 Kelvin. how can we use this to create an interesting look? Option number one would be to use our daylight balance light as the key light and have a warm accent light in the background. And that looks pretty decent, it's all right. But what if you want to have a bit more of a modern look and a bit more of a color contrast? Because the warm light in the background is nice, but it also matches relatively closely with our skin tones, so it does not create a great contrast. You know, if the background looks the same as the subject in the foreground, then it doesn't give you the kind of contrast that you could have. But what if we could use color theory and use a complementary color for the background? Something more bluish would be great, right? Any idea how we could do it? I actually would love to sit like in a big studio right now and see a bunch of like raising hands right now. But since that's not possible, I'm gonna answer for you. There's something super easy that we can do. Let's just switch out those lights and see what happens. All right, so now we have our warm 3200 Kelvin light as the key light and the daylight balance light is in the background. And now with a simple change, we can make our key light an accurate white and magically turn our background into a blue light. And all we did was set the white balance to the new key light, the tungsten light that we used. And by doing that, we automatically made our daylight balance light appear blue. Because remember, we moved the scale. So originally 5600 Kelvin was neutral, but since now 3200 Kelvin is neutral, 56,000 Kelvin suddenly appears blue. No need for color gels, no need for RGB lighting, just simple white balance. So now let's talk about how to achieve perfect white balance exactly how we like it. Thankfully, there are a lot of tools available to us, and I want to start with the one that is the easiest, the least useful, and also the one that you probably already know, and that is auto white balance. On auto white balance, your camera interprets the frame and makes a guess about what the white balance should be like. And usually the results get pretty close to what you actually want, but there are a couple of things that make auto white balance pretty much the wrong choice for 99% of the time. Number one, auto white balance is not reliably accurate, because if it was, everybody obviously would use it all the time, because why worry about it if you can just, get it right without worrying about it? But let's just quickly demonstrate the limits of auto white balance. My key light here is at 5600 Kelvin, and for reference, I have my color checker in the frame. I will record this shot once in custom manual white balance at 5600 Kelvin and once at auto white balance. Let's look at the difference.
All right, guys, so here we can see on the left side, the one that is actually 5600 Kelvin custom manual white balance. And on the right side, we see the automatic white balance. And on first glance, actually, it's not that much difference in there, right? And the reason for that is that this is a very, easy, basic frame with not a lot of color going on. So the internal auto white balance has a relatively easy job to, have a good result. But still, we can see if we take this cool little tool here in DaVinci Resolve, which shows us the color channels, red, green, and blue, right? And here you can see on the gray card, they are pretty much on spot on the exact same level. And then we go to the right image, we can see consistently that there's a little bit too much blue. So now let's look at the next clip.
Number two, auto white balance easily gets confused by colors in the frame. To show you what I mean, let's just use a bunch of colorful objects and put them under the same lighting conditions. We have our key light here again at 5600 Kelvin daylight balance. And so correct white balance should make clean whites on our color checker. Let's record one reference frame with the white background and see how well it works.
All right, so here we have the reference frame. And the only thing that we really want to mention here is that when we check the middle gray, then we see that there's not enough green in the shot consistently, and we can see that here too. If we pay close attention, then we can see that the green is not exactly on the same level. You can also see that here, which is actually a great way of seeing it too, is that in this case, because the background is gray, all the things right here, this part and this part, where you see some purple here and some green down here, this all should be relatively white. All right, and so you can see here that the green is coming down in the shadows right here and right here. That's the indication as well that there's not enough green. The greens need to be lifted a little bit, which then will balance out the complete image. But let's look at the next options and see what happens.
Now let's see what happens if I change the color of my shirt.
All right, here we go. So on the right side, we see the reference frame. On the left side, we see a different image where, in fact, I did not change my shirt, but I just thought I might as well put on a very colorful jacket. So, and we can already see the setting is exactly the same. The lighting is exactly the same. If we take a comparison from left to right, we see that my skin tones are definitely more red than they should be. If we pay attention, if you compare this to this, there's a very strong difference in how this looks healthy and normal, and this looks reddish. Like, if you can see, there is some sort of red tint in there. And so that's the first proof that there is actually, serious change happening just from the color of the jacket in the frame, which actually, it's still a very relatively easy frame. The background is white. There's no, inconsistent lighting or anything. So let's move on to the next one.
And now let's bring down the yellow backdrop and see what happens.
All right, guys, and here we can see finally the damage of auto white balance. On the right side, again, the reference frame, and on the left side, we put down the yellow backdrop. And guys, what the heck, what's going on here? Look at the blue tint in my skin. That's already, in this case, obviously we can still fix it, especially if we have a color checker in the frame, but that just goes to show you the wild inconsistency of auto white balance when the subject is still the same, lighting is still the same, the backdrop change, which is something that can definitely happen. You can obviously always have a scene that has a totally different background when you just move around with the camera, which just, again, shows that auto white balance, you just do not want to use that. Take off your fingers out of auto white balance and you will be much more happy for it.
So as you can see, auto white balance has a problem with color changing in the frame, because in reality the white balance should stay exactly the same because the light did not change. The third, and in my opinion, KO argument against auto white balance is the fact that it continues to adjust white balance as the camera is recording. In other words, the supposed benefit makes it completely useless for me. I would prefer consistently slightly wrong white balance over a mostly perfect auto white balance that keeps changing in between all day long. And the reason is obviously consistency. If we have one clip that is continuously recorded at the very same slightly wrong white balance, chances are we can easily correct it in post and we're done with a few clicks. But if we have a clip that basically changes white balance all the time continuously within one clip, it's pretty much impossible to make the clip look uniformly correct, as there will be constant changes in color temperature that we cannot correct after the fact. And that makes the footage completely useless for any serious results. So my clear recommendation, do not use auto white balance. Now, as I was researching, I actually found out that there are a bunch of cameras that have a setting that is basically auto white balance, but it stops changing after you start recording. So that actually would probably be not such a terrible idea in comparison to traditional auto white balance, because the main problem, doesn't exist anymore. But I probably still wouldn't recommend auto white balance, and you will find out why within the next points that I'm going to make. Now, if you paid attention, I said 99% of the time auto white balance is wrong, and there's only one exception that comes to my mind, and that is if you need to get a shot where you go from one color temperature into another color temperature, and you need it to be a one take. Because then, while still obviously not being a perfect result, auto white balance is pretty much the only easy way to manage this shot at all. Two different white balances in very different environments. So let's continue with the next option, and that is using the internal white balance presets that most cameras have available. Here's how it works. Depending on your camera model, there are a couple of presets ready to use that represent situation with specific color temperatures. For example, we have daylight, shade, cloudy, incandescent, fluorescent warm white, fluorescent cold white, fluorescent day white, fluorescent daylight. And all of these options set the white balance to a value that represents the typical white balance for all those scenarios. And by the way, those were the ones that I have available on my Sony a7 III, for example. Yours might differ a little bit, but generally it's kind of the same thing in every modern camera. So those presets are pretty handy because without thinking much, you will be probably able to find the correct setting for many situations. And compared to auto white balance, they also have the huge benefit of not changing any longer. As soon as you have it set once, they don't change automatically in any sort of way. And so in comparison, it's going to be much easier to correct any mistakes in post as long as it's not too far off the right setting. Now, all that being said, there are some limitations that come with using those presets. The first one is, in my opinion, a lack of flexibility. Now, using those presets and getting used to them could keep you from learning the necessary basics of white balance yourself to make the right decisions on your own. And at the end of the day, if you think about it, all the camera does here with those presets is it remembers the values of typical situations. You might as well do that same thing yourself. Daylight is 5600 Kelvin, golden hour is around 4000 Kelvin, tungsten is 3200 Kelvin, and so forth. You can and should learn those rough values yourself, because honestly, getting close enough within a couple of hundred Kelvin, to the correct white balance is something that you can correct in post without any problem. So the main reason why I would not recommend using those presets is that it keeps you from learning those easy but valuable bits of knowledge to have those presets saved in your brain instead of your camera, so that you can create the image you like, even if you change cameras or you don't have those usual presets anymore. Now let's move to the next and probably most accurate option, and that is to set custom white balance by using a reference object. How does that work? So one more time, let's remember what white balance actually does. We know that it is a setting that helps the camera interpret what white is, okay? And there's a function in most cameras that enables you to literally show the camera something white, or in other words, something neutral, that is without any sort of color cast. It's just neutral, it's without any color. And in that way, help it set the white balance based off of that object. Now, you might think that any white or gray object might work well with this. A piece of paper, a gray shoelace, your white sneakers, and no offense, without taking into account any further knowledge about the cleanliness of your sneakers, it would probably work relatively fine. But the problem is that although something might appear neutral to us, most certainly there are still color casts in the material that can contaminate the reading of the camera and give out a slightly inaccurate white balance setting. I would say that it is probably easily fixable in post, but the issue then will be less one of not having enough of a correctable range, but more that you don't know exactly what is actually the accurate setting, because there is nothing truly neutral in the frame. So for that problem, we have something called a white balance card. White balance cards are absolutely neutral in every lighting situation, and therefore the perfect tool to set manual white balance in camera. Another really common solution is the 18% gray card. Hold on, here we go. This one in the middle is 18% gray. Those are usually used to determine exposure, but they also work fairly well for setting white balance in my experience. And I think they're actually more common. Like, more people buy those in order to set white balance instead of actual white balance card. And I think many people don't even know the difference. And here's how it goes. Take your white balance or gray card and position them where your subject is going to be in the same lighting situation. That's important. And now come as close as you need with your camera until the circle in the middle is filled by the balance card, and set the white balance. And that's it. I also recommend shooting just a second of footage or something so that you have your reference point, in post-production as well, in frame, so you can make any sort of adjustments in post-production. And now, as long as the lighting situation stays the same, you will have accurate white balance all day long. Another big benefit of this option is also that it automatically addresses not only the color temperature, but also the tint that might exist in the existing lighting, which otherwise would be another manual setting that you have to take care of, either, on set or in post-production. Now, if you have the time, this is probably the best and most accurate way to get on-point white balance, on set, and leave only a minimum amount of work for post-production. But before that, let's continue with the last option that I probably use most of the time at work, and that is custom manual white balance based off of the lighting situation. Here's how it works. In your camera settings, there's an option where you can manually set the Kelvin temperature that you want to white balance to. This setting offers you the maximum amount of manual control over white balance, and it comes in actually really handy, as long as you know what lights you're working with, or in other words, which color temperature you're working with. Now, you might have noticed that the most accurate and the most used option are not the same for me. And the reason is simple. I don't always have a gray card with me, and often I don't have the time to redo the white balance every single clip in a new lighting. And for those scenarios, it's really helpful to know your lights and, to know color temperatures in general, like we said in the beginning. It's really helpful to know what daylight is. It's really helpful to know what overcast sky is, what typical indoor lighting looks like, and the settings with which those lighting lights create accurate colors. And honestly, most of the time, that is fairly simple. My key light for 90% of the time will be a daylight balance LED panel at 5600 Kelvin, just like right now. And whenever I'm outside, I start with 5600 Kelvin, and I actually adjust by eye to the correct direction until it works for me, just based on what I see on the monitor. And when I'm inside, I do the same thing, but I start with 3200 Kelvin and then go from there and adjust as well. And this gives me a fast workflow and results that I can always and pretty much reliably bring to accurate colors in post-production if they are not already where they should be. And in addition to that, whenever I have the time, I try to have a gray card or the color checker in the frame at least once, so I have a reference to correct towards in post-production. And talking about the color checker, this is actually a recent purchase that I made that I'm really excited about because it not only has a white balance card, but those colorful rectangles here let me reach complete color accuracy beyond mere white balance settings. But more on that in a different class. And those are basically the most common ways to get white balance on set. Honestly, I strongly recommend that you get off of the auto or preset options, and I guess that's kind of the reason for this whole class in general in the first place, and start getting comfortable with judging white balance and getting a feel for it, In reality, here's what's important. It is to reliably be close enough to the perfect setting that you can make the last adjustments in post without risking image quality. And if you do want to go the extra mile, make use of white balance cards or even a color checker for overall perfect colors and exposure. How to fix white balance in post. Very well, so far we have talked about what white balance is, how it influences our image, and also how to set correct white balance in camera. In this video, we'll go through the process of correcting white balance in post, because correcting white balance is actually a standard step in even, the most basic color correction workflows. It's really important because pretty much no camera gets it perfectly right every single time, even if you have the perfect settings. And even if something looked good in camera and was shot with the help of a white balance card, chances are there will be some room for correction. And this becomes even more important when you try to match 2 or more different camera models within one video, because different cameras will interpret color differently. So even the exact same white balance in the same lighting will lead to different color temperatures in the final image, when it comes from different cameras. So being able to fix the final image uniformly will help you balance out different images from different cameras. So let's go through a couple of ways to fix white balance in a few different scenarios with increasing difficulty.
All right, guys, so we have 3 examples right here. And in the first one, I will teach you how to do basically the easiest and most probably accurate thing to do if you want to fix up white balance. And that works if you have a color checker just like this somewhere in the frame. And just remember, guys, for that, it's definitely enough to have it in one frame in the beginning, as long as the lighting situation is the same. Obviously, you could just apply the same basic color correction to the next clip as well. And here's how it works. This works in DaVinci Resolve. It also works in Premiere Pro. And here in Resolve, it goes like this. You go to this tab here, which is the color match tab. And here you can already see the representation of a color checker. Similar to this one, but not the same. And that's because right here, we have to select the correct one, X-Rite Color Checker Passport Video. And then the next thing is to choose the source gamma. So that's kind of the picture profile that you were recording in. In this case, it was Blackmagic Design 4.6K film. That's it. And target gamma, we leave at Rec 709 target color space as well. Color temperature, I also would recommend leaving it just as it is. And then we go here and click color chart. And that's a representation of the color checker. So now we have to align the corners with the actual color checker in the frame so that those little squares match up exactly with the color checker, just like this. And then all we have to do is match, and we have a perfectly balanced picture. And the good thing is that this is not only fixing the white balance, this is fixing all the colors, this is fixing all the contrast settings and stuff like that. So that's a really nice thing to do. If you want to have a fast fix and you have the time to use this color checker, I definitely recommend doing it. Now, but this is still a fairly, automatic sort of feature, right? So, and sometimes, for some reason, and please don't ask me why, I'm not sure, but sometimes it just doesn't work out exactly the way you want because somehow the colors are still off in some sort of way. But there's actually also a totally manual way of fixing exactly the same thing, which is with curves. So right here we have green, cyan, blue, magenta, red, and yellow. And those are exactly the same colors that we have right here. And if we look closely on our color chart right here, we can see that those points here are visible in the image. What I would do is I would start with the color checker, and now we have nice spaces, and we can see that it's not that bad actually, but for example, the green channel is somehow totally off. So what I like to do is then I go into the curves, and right now I'm under hue versus hue, right? So now, let me just take that off, and take a look at the colors right here. And let's start actually with the green, and see how it changes. You can see how it changes. It's actually funny how much we can change it. We can literally go to, purple and stuff. But anyway, right there, down here, you can see this is supposed to be where the green is, but it's right here. So we have to take it down and remember to stay on the green line here. And this is actually where the green should be. Now let's quickly adjust all of the colors. First with the hue, which is basically, like where it is on the clock. Turning around, let's adjust all the colors. This looks good. Looking good. Looking good. Looking good as well. And yellow. And now you can see still some of them don't line up within the square that they should be in. And that's because we have to change the saturation. So we do the same thing. Mark, 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 mark. And then we start with the red a little bit higher. Yellow a little bit less. Green a little bit higher. And we might have to adjust the hue again. A little bit higher. Magenta quite a bit higher. And that's it. Go back to hue, change the green again. And there we go. And those are even better colors compared to before. And just look at the difference from before and after. Fantastic change. And this is how we get perfect colors. Look at the skin tones, how they look so natural, so clean. You know, that's always the best indicator, because we, at the end of the day, the best way we recognize that as humans when something is wrong, when something is off, are the skin tones. So that's by far the most important thing at all times, to have the skin tones on the right path. Let's go to the next shot. And here we want to fix the white balance without the help of a color checker. And we can see just by looking at it that basically it's just, first of all, it's too warm. All right, so it's too warm. So we might as well try a little bit and balance it out just like this. I want to change back to Parade to get a better image. And we can see that, you know, it's kind of easy, just even by kind of feel, to find a good spot. Maybe something like that. The important thing is always to look at the skin tones. Right now I feel like there's a tiny little bit of green in there. Yeah, and that's it. And you see, that's the easiest way to fix white balance super fast, if you just get a feeling for what's correct. So another way of doing this would be reset it, go here with white balance tool right here down below. This one here. And click on a white surface, and that's already it. And that looks good too, right? The skin tones look nice, the colors are neutral as they should be, and that's the second way of doing it. Now the third way is really, let's imagine we do not have the chance to click somewhere because there is nothing gray or white in the frame. Let's do it completely just by feel. All right, so we take the temperature slider here and we just move. First of all, we can see it's too cold, right? So we want to move it until it looks good, something like this, right? And then we have to obviously fix other things too here, like contrast and stuff. But the white balance is good. And that's how we fix white balance. You know, it's actually not that complicated. There's accurate, you know, sort of scientific proven ways to always get it right. There are different ways of getting it right when, you know, have limitations in the image. And you can also just, at the end of the day, you have to develop some sort of feel for what is correct and work with that. So that's it. So those scenarios should give you a good overview of the different situations that can occur during normal conditions. As you can see, the amount of work you put in on set can influence quite a bit how much work you have to put in afterwards. One really important point that can make your life a lot easier, again, is continuity. Obviously, it's best to always be perfect on point with your settings, but the next best thing to that is to be continuously and consistently just slightly off, because that is definitely better than sometimes being off and sometimes being perfect, because then you have this inconsistency problem and you have to, you know, check really on a clip by clip basis, and sometimes even during the clips, and that really gets super tedious and takes forever. So if you, for example, in the middle of a shoot notice that you have a tiny slight color twist in it, I would literally continue recording knowing that I could right now create a better image, because you save a lot of time in post-production, because your image can probably take this little change in color correction, and you save yourself, you know, potentially hours of color correction if you just leave it that way. As I said in the last video, my personal goal with white balance on set is to get as close as possible to perfect white balance within the limited time that I have for this specific shoot. So consequently then, in the next step, let's find out how close we should be to still be able to maintain not only accurate but also good looking colors, good looking results, and an image that doesn't suffer too much in image quality. How wrong can I be and still fix it in post? All right, so let's take a look at how wrong we can be on set and still be able to fix it in post-production. And for that, I just created a really simple setup for us to test. This is going to be our reference frame. The light is a 5600 Kelvin LED panel, and I custom set the white balance with my white balance card on my color checker passport. This is the baseline, all right? This is how the image should look if you're interested in truly accurate colors. Now, let's look at the same image shot in different white balances and see if we can correct it and compare it to the perfect reference frame that we had in the beginning. Okay, so like I said, here on the right side, we have our reference frame, like it says here, at 5600 Kelvin. Let's start at the beginning with 6000 Kelvin. Okay, this is like 400 degrees Kelvin off. We already know that this is probably going to be fairly easy to grade. That's not a big range, so we just try it out. Take the white balance tool, click onto the white, and this looks actually fairly good. It's a little bit more blue than the image that we have here, so let's try again maybe on the gray. But at the end of the day, the point of this is to see that it's definitely way within the range to correct it. This might even be a little bit warm, actually. Something like this would be fine. So that's 400 degrees off, no problem. Now, this would be 6500 Kelvin, which is, you know, 900 above what it should be. Let's take a step. Again, white balance tool. Click on the white, and still, it looks fairly okay. Not a problem. We can see the change was obviously bigger, but it still matches and it's fine. So now we have 7000 Kelvin. This is quite a bit off already. So usually if you pay attention to what you're doing, that sort of stuff shouldn't happen. It rarely happens. It only happens if you have to be like really fast from shot to shot on an event shoot or something, and you kind of mess it up because it's too quick. Then this might happen. But even now, let's check it out. So let's go ahead and take a step. Take the white balance tool again. Click on the white, and voila, again. Pretty much okay. I don't see big problems still. The range becomes bigger and bigger of how much it corrects. But that's definitely still well within the range of correction. So, you know, 7000, that's fine. Let's go down the different direction. Let's go cooler. This is 4500 Kelvin, all right? That's already 900 off in the different direction. I'm pretty sure that's going to work fine. Let's just check it out. Again, on the white. Okay. We can see, could be a little warmer. Something like that. So this looks fine. No problem. No, you know, the image doesn't break apart. This is still fine. Now, this is 3200 Kelvin, and I don't know about you, but to me, this looks way more off than the 7000, partly because it is way more off, because it's 2400 Kelvin off. Let's take a look if that works. Okay, that's a pretty big difference. Click on the white, And now we can see that the image starts falling apart a bit. It's probably possible to make it look okay, because at the end of the day, nobody's going to compare the blue of the shirt to the correct blue, because there won't be a shot with the correct blue, probably. And even if you could probably fix that with hue versus hue corrections, like this one's here. But yeah, that just goes to show that at this point it starts falling apart already. So now let's give it give it the rest. This is 2700 Kelvin. All right, so we just take the color, the white balance tool, again apply it, and yeah, I mean, this is just a mess. Let's try again on the white. Maybe that goes better. No, I mean, just look at the skin tones, how they kind of look nuclear, like they're about to blow up. I wouldn't use on a commercial shoot anymore. And even for myself, I mean, this looks just awful. This green. You might still, if you spend like super much time in post and you have a stronger codec than this 8-bit footage from Sony, you might be able to pull it off. But, you know, at the end of the day, a shot like this should not happen. You know, this is 2700 Kelvin. This is wildly off of what the actual white balance is. Any camera monitor will show you that this is not accurate, even if you don't have a accurate representation in the same screen. No problem. I mean, just look at the difference, you know. Everybody knows what skin tones look like, and they don't look like nuclear like this. So just make sure, guys, that proves what we want. That proves what I thought from the beginning, which is close enough is good enough. I mean, obviously, you should always have it perfect as much as you can, but you can be rest assured that, you know, even if it's 1000 Kelvin off, that will be fine to you know, correct the image if you have a strong enough codec for sure. So that's it for this one. Alright guys, so thank you so much for watching. I hope I delivered on my promise that you now actually understand white balance. I also hope you now feel confident to capture images with accurate white balance, and even if something might have gone wrong, that you feel confident to change those things after the fact to correct your image, so that you can deliver a good looking video to your client, to yourself, to whoever's watching. So again, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you like the way I'm teaching, you can check out some of my other classes.